Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for participating in CTAC Patient Input Consultation webinar for ECS Path, which is Gilead's new fixed-dose combination product to treat HIV infection. My name is Barbara Santos-Woso, and I am one of the policy researchers at CTAC. And before we begin, I would just like to ask anyone who has already not done so to please mute their line by pressing *6 on their phones to avoid any interference during the first portion of the webinar. And if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box, and we'll have time at the end of the presentation to have more of a discussion. So before we begin, I just wanted to take a moment to tell you a little bit about our organization, the Canadian Treatment Action Council, otherwise known as CTAC. And for those of you who aren't familiar with our work, CTAC is Canada's national civil society organization, and we address access to treatment, care, and support for people living with HIV and viral hepatitis co-infection. And at CTAC, we meaningfully engage with a broad number of stakeholders, which range from people living with HIV and hepatitis C, frontline service providers, healthcare professionals, and policy makers. We work in collaboration to identify, develop, and implement program and policy solutions. Our agenda for today is as follows. I'll begin with speaking a little bit about the Common Drug Review and provide a review of market access to treatments in Canada, followed by an introduction to and some key characteristics of ECS Path. And then I'll go into some of the key clinical findings from ECS Path clinical trials. And after that, I will explain to you how you could have your voice heard as a person living with HIV or a caregiver, and then everyone will have the opportunity to engage in a discussion and ask any questions that may arise. So we usually begin our webinars by providing an overview of market access and the Common Drug Review. And more recently, we've created a video that captures how drugs get to market in less than 5 minutes. So at this point, what I'm going to do is show you this video, and then we'll resume with the rest of the presentation after.
Canada has a unique healthcare system, and sometimes it can be complicated to navigate. Canada's healthcare system is made up of 13 separate provincial and territorial programs and 6 additional federal plans, making healthcare in Canada a shared responsibility between the federal, provincial, and territorial governments. A drug can take as long as a decade to develop, and our regulatory review bodies might take as many as 5 more years to conduct thorough reviews. So what's going on during that time, and how do medical treatments get from clinical trials to a public insurance plan? Once a pharmaceutical manufacturer has created a new treatment or molecule, they must take it through clinical trials before bringing it to market in Canada. These trials evaluate whether a drug works and whether it's safe. A drug can take years to develop and study, with clinical trials often involving hundreds of people testing the drug. Manufacturers will create many molecules, but only those that prove effective during clinical trial are developed further. Some molecules are developed and never advance to become a treatment. It is important to consider that treatment development costs a lot of money, and manufacturers will generally seek to recoup those costs. When the manufacturer is confident that they have a competitive, effective treatment, they will submit the drug, along with clinical trial data, to Health Canada for review. Health Canada reviews the drug to determine if it provides clinical benefit and if it is safe. Once Health Canada concludes that a drug is safe and likely to provide clinical benefit, it is approved for sale on the market and can appear on private insurance plans. However, if a drug is to be listed in most of Canada's public formularies, the process is long from over. These are the public drug plans that many Canadians depend on in order to access essential medications. After Health Canada approval, the drug in question is reviewed by another body, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health, or CTAF. This agency is funded by the federal and provincial governments, except Quebec, which has an independent process. CTAF oversees a process called the Common Drug Review, or CDR, which conducts a review called Health Technology Assessment, or HTA. Many countries conduct HTAs, and there are different ways to measure health technologies. An HTA is conducted not just on medications and drugs, but but also on any health technology, like a new pacemaker design, for example. Ultimately, the Common Drug Review seeks to answer the question, is this treatment cost-effective, and will it provide improved clinical benefits to Canadians? The Common Drug Review will assess the drug for listing on public insurance plans and must conclude whether it can provide equal or improved clinical benefit compared to its cost, and whether that makes it more cost-effective than similar treatments. How much money should be spent to achieve how much clinical benefit? Once the CDR concludes its assessment, it sends a recommendation to all health plans, federal, provincial, and territorial, as to whether or not the provinces should cover the cost of this medication and list it on their plan. The CDR will suggest that the provinces either A. List the treatment, B. List the treatment with clinical criteria and/or conditions, C. Not list the treatment at the submitted price, or D. Not list the treatment at all. Most treatments do not get an unconditional listing suggestion, and the majority are either not recommended for listing or recommended with conditions. In fact, in many of their reviews, the CDR has rejected or suggested not to list at a manufacturer's submitted price. Listing recommendations from the CDR are not binding or final. The provinces and territories receive the recommendation and are free to review the drug against their own standards or make their own conclusion from the Health Canada and CDR reviews. This allows provinces to realize local priorities and more closely manage provincial healthcare needs based on their budgets and populations. Each province does this independently, as each is the public payer of their respective province or territory. While many provinces and territories conduct their own reviews, some smaller provinces tend to follow the CDR recommendation and list or not list accordingly. As new drugs are developed and new needs are realized, provinces and territories must be vigilant to maintain a public listing that addresses contemporary local realities and responsibilities. Often, older treatments must be considered against newer treatments to see which contributes the most value for the most reasonable cost. This system is designed to review and respond to new treatments as they are developed, while allowing room for both price evaluation and regional healthcare priorities. Conducting HTA reviews at several levels with room for conditions allows provinces and territories more control over their public plans and healthcare mandates, while still allowing Health Canada and the CDR to review every treatment at the federal level. Timely and reasonable access to effective
Okay, so just to quickly summarize the drug approval process.
and safe medicines is a healthcare priority for Canadians, and while the processes described here account for cost, safety, and
submission to determine its safety and efficacy. And if the results
efficacy, some critics worry that they are redundant, duplicative, and very costly. Additionally, some critics note that the multiple points of review have resulted in some drugs being available on some public plans, but not others. Therefore, not all Canadians have access to the same treatment options. Is there a better way to realize our healthcare priorities at a reasonable price without rushing our review of safety and efficacy?
For our drug, and they'll also look at patient evidence. They collect patient input and want to know what people who are living with the condition and caregivers think of the drug under consideration. And because most people access HIV medications through publicly available drug programs, this step is particularly important in determining the accessibility of medications in Canada. Then after that, all jurisdictions are provided with formulary listing recommendations, and that's either to list with criteria and or conditions, do not list at current price, or do not list. And the purpose of this webinar is really to ensure that the inclusion of people who are living with HIV are present in the patient input process. And by you participating and completing the survey, you're helping us provide the information to the Common Drug Review in their consideration of this drug for listing on public insurance plans. So now that we've gone over the market access piece, I will go into some of the clinical trial findings for ECS Path. But before I do that, I'm going to begin with a brief overview of ECS Path and its development. So ECS Path is a once-daily fixed-dose combination therapy that consists of 4 medicines. One of these is an integrase inhibitor, alpetegravir. The second is cobicistat, which is a boosting agent, and cobicistat has no antiviral activity. Its main purpose is to maintain levels of alpetegravir in the blood. The third component is entricitabine, which is a nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor, NRTI. And then the fourth is tenofovir alafenamide, which I'll refer to as TAF from here on out. And TAF is a new prodrug of tenofovir. And what prodrugs are is they're medicines that are inactive until they're taken. They then convert into their active form once they're processed by the body. So when TAF is absorbed by cells, it's converted into tenofovir. So some of you may have noticed that 3 out of 4 of the components of ECS TAF are present in the single tablet regimen Stribold, which has been approved for sale in Canada in 2012. The only difference is that Stribold contains tenofovir disoproxil fumarate, PDF, which was approved in 2002, and TAF, ECS TAF includes tenofovir alafenamide. TDF is highly effective in viral suppression, and for that reason, it's been one of the most commonly used HIV treatments, both in clinical trials and in several regimens. For treatment-naive people living with HIV, it's a component in 4 out of 5 regimens recommended by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, so the DHHS guidelines, including Stribold, and then Truvada as a backbone for Tivicay, Prezista, and Icentris. It's also a component of 2 commonly used alternative regimens, a triple and Complera. However, with TDF, there's been some concern of use and its association with new or worsening kidney impairment or serious kidney disease, as well as decreased bone mineral density in a small minority of people. And why is this of concern? Well, we see that people with HIV are more likely to develop comorbidities, such as kidney, liver, and cardiovascular disease than the general population. And this is due to several risks, including co-infection and antiviral treatments themselves. And people are also living longer. In fact, more than 35% are aged 50 or older and are more susceptible to inflammation and non-infectious comorbidities, including bone fractures and renal failure at earlier ages. And this has been shown to be the case for people who are HIV positive between the ages 41 to 60 who are living with at least one comorbidity. And if we look at people living with HIV who are aged between 41 and 50, they're 16 times more likely to develop renal failure and 46 times more likely to develop renal failure when they're over the age of 60. And then if we look at bone fractures, people living with HIV between the ages 40 to 60 are 12 to 16 times more at risk than those uninfected with HIV at risk for bone fractures. So in response to the long-term medical needs of people living with HIV, Gilead developed TAF, which not only requires a lower dosage of TDF, is smaller in pill size due to its lower concentration and has potent antiviral activity, but it also has a different pathway than TDF. Both TDF and TAF are prodrugs of tenofovir, which, like I mentioned, means they are converted into tenofovir. Now, the difference lies in their mechanism of action. TDF would enter the plasma and it is converted to tenofovir in the blood, and then tenofovir is taken up into the cells. This requires higher dosages of TDF to do this. TAF, on the other hand, is concentrated in cells rather than in the blood and is converted into tenofovir intracellularly. As a result, plasma levels of tenofovir are much lower, in fact 91% lower with TAF than with TDF. Because it's not concentrated in the blood as is TDF, early findings indicate that TAF won't affect the kidney or bones in the way that TDF does, and it might even kill the virus better. Over the next couple of slides, I will go through some of the key findings from 4 ECS Path clinical trials that took place in treatment-naive adults and adolescents, virologically suppressed individuals, and suppressed adults with significant renal impairment. And bear with me, I just want to ensure that everyone understands the context in which these clinical trials took place. In the first study findings I will go through are the phase 3 international combined study of 104 and 111, which evaluated ECS TAF and compared it to Stribals in 1,773 treatment-naive adults. In the first group, 866 participants were given ECS TAF once daily or a Stribals placebo once daily, and in the second group, 867 participants were given Stribals or an ECS TAF placebo once daily. At week 48, the primary objective in the study was to assess the non-inferiority of ECS TAF to Stribals, and at weeks 96 and 144, the efficacy, safety, and tolerability was assessed. At week 48, ECS TAF was shown to be non-inferior to Stribals, where 92% of participants taking ECS TAF and 90% of participants taking Stribals achieved HIV RNA levels of less than 50 copies. In addition, they also saw an increase in CD4 cell counts, and these were higher in the ECS TAF arm, where an increase of 211 was seen versus 181 in the Stribals arm. In week 48, there was a very low rate of drug resistance for those taking ECS TAF. In fact, only 0.8 participants developed resistance versus 0.6% in the Stribals arm, so less than 1% in both arms. With respect to safety, discontinuations due to adverse events were low in both treatment arms, 0.9% in the ECS TAF arm versus 1.5% in the Stribals arm, and the most common side effects were diarrhea, nausea, headache, and upper respiratory tract infection. Both regimens were well tolerated and no unique adverse events associated with TAF occurred. In the study, no renal adverse events were observed in the ECS TAF arm versus 0.5% in the Stribals arm. And no Fanconi syndrome or scupulopathy were observed in both arms, and both of these are disorders of the kidney tubes in which certain substances normally absorbed into the bloodstream by the kidneys are released into the urine instead. Everyone in this study underwent DEXA scans to measure their bone mineral density. What we can see here is that there was significantly less effect in the spinal and hip bone mineral density in the ECS TAF arm than in the Stribals arm. Now in the second study, which was a phase 2 to 3 single-arm open-label two-part study, 50 HIV treatment-naive adolescents aged 12 to 18 years of age were given ECS TAF to determine the steady-state pharmacokinetics of albuterol and TAF, to confirm the once-daily dosing of ECS TAF, and to evaluate its safety and tolerability through week 24, and then efficacy was also observed through week 48. And the findings from this trial at week 24 have shown that 91% were able to achieve virologic success. There was no emergent resistance, no discontinuation due to side effects. There was no renal adverse events, and there was 9% or 2 out of 23 participants who did experience virologic failure, but both were able to achieve virologic suppression at later time points. And I also wanted to mention that when ECS TAF is administered to adults, TAF and PSC exposure is comparable to that seen in adults, confirming its once daily dosing. In this slide, I think it's really important to mention that there was gains in both spinal and total bone mineral density, and this is really important because we don't see any bone loss. So overall, what we see in terms of findings is consistent in both treatment-naive adolescents as it is in adults. In the third study, Study 109, 1,436 biologically suppressed adult patients participated in a phase 3, 96-week clinical trial where they switched from their other TDF-containing regimen to ECS Path once daily, and the other TDF-containing regimens included Stribal, Atripla, or Atazanavir with a Truvada backbone, and Atazanavir was boosted with either Cobicistat or Ritonavir. 959 participants were switched to ECS TAF once daily, while the other 477 continued their current regimen. The primary endpoint in this study was to evaluate non-inferiority of switching versus continuation of current regimen at week 48, and secondary endpoint was to evaluate safety, tolerability, and efficacy through weeks 48 and 96. In the study, those who switched experienced 97% virologic success versus 93% for those who stayed on their current regimen, and only 1% experienced virologic failure in both arms. So essentially what this means is switching to ECS TAF was found to be statistically superior in efficacy compared to continuing on their other TDF-containing regimens. Now if we want to look at each treatment individually, switching to ECS TAF from Atripla had a 96% virologic success rate versus 90%, a 97% success rate when switching from a boosted Atazanavir plus Truvada backbone versus 92% when staying on it, and a 98% virologic success rate versus 97% success rate when continuing to stay on Stribal. Significant improvements in multiple tests of renal function were also observed among people who were treated with ECS TAF compared to other TDF-based regimens. And if we look at bone mineral density, we can see that switching from ECS TAF from a regimen containing TDF and third agent resulted in increases in both spine and hip bone mineral density at week 48. And if we look at spinal bone mineral density on the left-hand side of the screen, we could also see that at baseline, 59% of people in the ECS TAF arm had normal BMD, and at week 48, this increased to 64%. Similar differences were seen in hip bone mineral density, where at baseline, 69% had bone mineral density, and this increased to 71% at week 48, versus those in other TDF-containing regimens who not only experienced a loss in both spinal and hip bone mineral density, but had increases in osteopenia and osteoporosis. Now, the last study that I will go through today is Study 112. And this is a 96-week study where 242 HIV-suppressed adults with renal impairment switched from ECS TAF to either a TDF or non-TDF containing regimen. The primary endpoint of this study was to examine any change from baseline in glomerular filtration rate, which is a test to check how well the kidneys are working at week 24. And the second endpoint was to examine efficacy, safety, and tolerability through weeks 48 and 96. And as you can see here, those who switched to ECS TAF had a 92% virologic success rate, only 1% experienced virologic failure, and 7 discontinued due to adverse events. In terms of discontinuation due to renal adverse events, 0.8% or 2 participants discontinued the study due to decreased glomerular filtration rate, neither with evidence of renal tubulopathy. Of these 2 participants, 1 suffered from hypertension and was using medication to treat that, so that was a possible reason. which was a combination of those drugs and the study drug. And then the other participant who discontinued in the study had hypertension-related chronic kidney disease, and therefore his decreased glomerular filtration rate was assessed to likely be attributed to that and not the study drug. It's also important to mention that there was no renal tubulopathy or Fanconi syndrome observed. And it's also important to mention that others in the study experienced no significant change in glomerular filtration rate compared to their baseline. And again, if we look at spine and hip bone mineral density, we see increases in both through to week 48. So in summary, TAF offers a new delivery of tenofovir, which is due to the fact that it's concentrated higher in the cells than in the plasma. Findings indicate that TAF will have decreased impact on the kidneys or bones and even to suggest gains in bone mineral density. And at the same time, it's highly efficacious with potent antiviral activity. This brings us to the end of the clinical trial findings for ECS Path, and now it's your turn. So for some of the next steps of how you can become involved in the patient input process, we've developed a user-friendly web-based survey for participants to fill out based on some of the questions that are included in the Common Drug Review form. So what's asked of you is to answer questions based on the impacts of living with or providing care services for a person living with HIV, the impact of current HIV treatments from either what you've observed or experienced, what adverse events are tolerable and which are not, what is the impact of HIV treatment on caregivers and or service providers, and lastly, for those of you who have taken ECS Path, how does it compare to currently available treatment? And you can find the survey in the chat box, but it will also be emailed to you. This brings us to the end of the webinar. I would like to thank each and every one of you for your participation. It's fundamental that your voices are included in the Common Drug Review. And so please don't forget to fill out our questionnaire as well as provide the link to others who may be interested in getting involved in the process as well. Thank you.